Welcome to Maranatha Fellowship, where we're building lives that make a difference. We're having our Life After session on this evening, so go ahead and start liking and sharing and get your people on. It's going to be a great session on tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about Acquainted with Grief, something that all of us deal with, and we're going to talk about how to deal with loss. And we've got a guest clinician on tonight. So I'm going to give you a minute to like, to share, to tell your cousin and them they need to get online. They can do it here at Facebook. If you have friends that do not have social media, tell them they can go to our YouTube site, which is Maranatha Fellowship CPHP. The CP is for Communion Point High Point. So that's Maranatha Fellowship CPHP on YouTube. And it's going to be good to see. I see y'all starting to clock in, and I'd like to report that my phone is showing comments. I can get comments on my Samsung, just like y'all iPhone people. We're going to have a good time this evening. We're going to give y'all just another minute, and then we'll get started. Let me see if I can slide over here to YouTube. Okay, good. We're up on YouTube. We are up on Facebook. All right, good. So, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. There are a lot of things that are going on in a lot of people's lives, and one of the things that's been happening is a lot of death from coronavirus, as well as just things happening in people's lives as a whole. And one of the things that I think that sometimes in the church arena is that we don't talk about death. We talk about heaven, we talk about going there, but we don't talk about who's left behind. We don't talk about the people that are still dealing with the process of having somebody that you love immensely not be here anymore, and how do you cope with that? How do you live with that? And so I don't think it's good for us to gloss over that. Scripture talks about Jesus in Isaiah 53. It says that he was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. So he knows what it feels like when people die. God knows what it feels like because his son died. So we know that death is a part of the equation, and we don't want to run and hide from it and not deal with it, especially when we have hard questions about why something happened or how it happened. So I thought it would be great for us to invest some time and go out and find a trained professional to help us here on tonight. And so tonight we have Miss April Herring from AuthoriCare with us, who has consented to be with us on tonight. Thank you so much. We appreciate you for being here. So thank you. You got a clap. You got a hand clap.
Oh,
we have a live audience too, y'all. So April, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into this field.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm going to try and do this quickly because I don't like talking about myself a whole lot. But I will say that God gets the glory for me sitting here today. And I come to you as a representative of AuthoriCare Collective, the Community Education and Outreach Coordinator, and the Faith Community Liaison. But I also sit here as a woman of faith. I sit here as one who is oriented in the Christian faith, and I like to believe that's strong enough in the Christian faith that I can share my faith with others. So there might be occasion during this hour that there may be someone who hears this conversation online or hears this conversation later, and they may say, well, I didn't know that AuthoriCare was a Christian organization. Well, AuthoriCare is not, but AuthoriCare has Christian people working there.
Right,
and so
right.
we are not affiliated, our organization, with any particular religion or faith, but we make space for all faiths and religions, and we care for the person, and whatever that person is carrying, we support them. But that said,
Okay.
I wanted to first say that God gets the glory for me sitting here because I was at a place in my life where I needed help with my mother when she was dying of cancer. And I got to the point where I was overwhelmed and tired and perplexed and just at the end of my rope as a caregiver. And I found out about Hospice of Greensboro, and hospice is our old name, Hospice of Greensboro, Hospice of Alamance Caswell. But long story short, this organization came into my life and my family's life and supported us in such a way and changed my outlook
Wow.
on being a caregiver, and also my outlook on just the physical process of death itself. Now, being a Christian, I have no problem with the spiritual aspect of death, but when you're watching the woman who gave you birth laying in a bed dying, that something different takes place in you.
Right.
And so there was so much support, so much information, so much empowerment that I received from AuthoriCare that after my mother passed away and after my pastor's mother passed away with hospice services, I told my husband, I said, I want to give back to that organization. Now, mind you, I had been a homemaker for 14 years. So my children, not only did I raise them, but they were big.
Grown children.
They were really big. And so, it had been 14 years where I'd focused on family and ministry. And I told him I want to give back. And so I started volunteering with AuthoriCare, and I volunteered for about two and a half years, and they invited me to join the staff as a paid employee. And that was 6 years ago.
Wow.
And so I became not only, I started as a non-believer in hospice services. I started as a skeptic of hospice services.
Wow.
But once I had that experience, and then that experience brought me into the knowledge and understanding of what hospice truly is and what hospice truly does for families and caregivers every single day, not just at the deathbed, but on the continuum of a chronic illness or advanced illness. And not only that, it doesn't end when the person or the loved one passes away, but then you have the support of the grief counseling department that come in and undergird you and support you.
Okay.
And all those who need that support. Not everyone needs counseling or wants counseling after a death, but for those of us who do, it is there. And it's absolutely free of charge, open to anyone in the community, even if you did not have a loved one to use our services. So that is a blessing.
Wow.
In our community. And
Wow.
we serve over 11 counties currently, and we're looking to serve even more. We're looking to expand. But back to the story, as I began working this role, and I had told my husband, and I also expressed to God that if I ever go back to work, now, I didn't really want to go back, but I said I was living the good life, but if I ever go back to work, it's going to be doing something that I really, really have a passion for, and that I feel lines up with the call on my life and lines up with my purpose in life. And sure enough, this job came just like out of nowhere. They did have to offer it to me 3 times because I was really reluctant to go back to work, but my husband kind of nudged me lovingly and gently. And then I saw it as an opportunity when I was so limited in my thinking when I said I want to give back. But when you speak those words before an almighty God who already knows the end of the story, who knows everybody's story, when you speak those words, it's kind of like saying, send me, I'll go. So here I am. He sent me, and here I am.
Wow.
And not only do I have what I've been trained to do and say as a hospice employee, but I have that experiential knowledge because I was there.
Okay.
I was there. I was in grief. I was in pain. I was in a caregiver role. So
Wow.
I can bring that out of my experience so that I can walk along with those who are on the journey now.
Wow. All right, so we're going to take advantage of that knowledge. We're going to allow you to present for us, and then we'll come back and have some conversations, and then we'll give everybody an opportunity. If you are in streaming or online, you can ask questions, and then we can ask questions in the audience also. So come on, let's hear from Miss April Herring.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to stand. I'm just more comfortable standing. I do have a PowerPoint, just a few slides that I want to share with you all today. And I'm going to try and get through these not too expediently because I want us to be able to process, but I do want to allow ample time for us to share. You know, it is healing to share, and we heal better together. When we're able to express, when we're able to share our stories, we just heal better. We feel better and we heal better. So being acquainted with grief, and I love that Pastor Rice shared that scripture from Isaiah, because truly the Lord does know. And I will go as far to say that only the Lord knows when we are in that place of grief. Only He knows exactly what we feel, exactly how much we hurt, how deep the pain is. Only He knows. But He knows, but even though we don't know exactly what another person may be feeling and the depths of that feeling, we can still support them. So we're going to talk about navigating the grief process. This is part 1, so you can advance to the next slide. Our goals for tonight is going to be to reevaluate how we look at grief and how we see and support those who are grieving. It's a lot in that first bullet, I know, but we're going to reevaluate how we look at grief and how we see and support those who grieve. And those of you who may be in a process of grieving right now, know that you are somebody. So we're not just talking about others. We're talking about how we support even ourselves when we are in our grief process. And we want to deepen our understanding of what the grief process looks like. What the grief process looks like. And we're going to learn a little bit about speaking grief. It's not supposed to be Greek. No, speaking grief, because grief has its own language. And then we're going to have some time for Q&A and sharing. But I will say this, that I love conversation. So if there is anything that comes up in the chat or comments or anything that you all have here in the live congregation on tonight, then just raise your hand and we'll stop. I hope it's okay to be that informal, Pastor Rice. Okay, so here we go. Next slide, please. So what is grief? And I know this is a cheesy picture and you can't really see it real good. It looked a little clearer on my laptop. So what is grief? Grief is the natural. I'll say that again. Natural. It's natural. Natural. Somebody say natural. Natural. I want us to get this. Grief is the natural response to death, loss, and change. So sometimes we will feel, and even sometimes people will make us feel that we are wrong for grieving, but grief is natural. And so when we talk about reevaluating how we look at grief, we're talking about our perspective on grief. What is our perspective? What do we feel about grief? How do we feel about grief? What do we think of when we hear the word grief or when we think of ourselves grieving? Grieving is natural. And I'm reminded of a text in the Bible where Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he's talking about when he is going to no longer be with them, that he is going to go away because he is going to be crucified. And he says to them, now is your time of grief. So I love that, because that is grief in the presence of the Lord. That's grief in the presence of the Lord, right? They were in the presence of the Lord God Almighty. But even the Lord God Almighty said, now's your time to grieve. So grief is not only natural, grief is something that we possess because we are in the likeness of God. Okay? We're able to go through this process because we are in his likeness. So he did not rebuke them for grieving. He didn't condemn them for grieving. He just simply said, just as it said in Ecclesiastes, now's the time to do this. This is your time to grieve. Somebody right now might be in their time for grief, their time of their grieving process, their time to reflect, their time to feel abnormal. But know that you are normal. Grieving is absolutely normal. And so I love what Jesus goes on to say. But he says, but I'm coming back. You'll see me again. So rejoice. So you see, there was grief, but there was the presence of the Lord. So there was reason to rejoice also. Do you know that joy and sorrow can live in the same heart? Y'all know that? It can. Joy and sorrow they can just tag team in our hearts. It doesn't have to be one or the other. I have sorrow when I think about my mother and father who died 1 year apart. They were only 56 years old. I have sorrow, but guess what? I have so much joy because first of all, I know that they knew the Lord, so I know that they're with him. And second of all, they taught me to know the Lord. And there's so much joy. There's joy in the memory. So this picture here, I don't know if you guys can see it well, but it's grief, not really personified, but just a picture of the grief process. And I don't know if you can see it well enough, but I would love for someone to take just a stab at explaining what that picture means. You have grief. You have grief in that huge, looks like a big trash bag. Then you have grief in a briefcase. And then you have grief, it looks like it's a purse. So guys, just imagine that's a wallet, I guess, for you guys. Somebody take a stab at what that means. Miss Thursday? Yes. Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Awesome. What a blessed woman of God. For those of you who didn't hear, Lady Thursday said that it started out big, right? This big load, this big bag that if you or I were trying to carry that around, it would be burdensome, right? That's how it starts out. But then the arrows represent time. And after a little time, as she said, it gets a little smaller. It's not really small, but it gets easier to carry. Grief gets easier to carry over time. And then you have another arrow, so that means you have some more time that passes. And then it gets even smaller, so small that you can tuck it into a bag, into a pouch. And so, as she said, it may not never ever leave you, but it does get easier and easier to carry. It gets easier and easier to deal with. It's not as big. It doesn't overwhelm as much. And so this really is the process of grief. Next slide, please. All right. I want to talk about some common misconceptions of grief. And this is really important, not just for the community at large, everyone who is either been in a grief process or those who are wanting to support people in their grief process, but this is particularly important for the church to understand that there are so many misconceptions about grief, and we have been, I think, traditionally moving along in the same cycle as those who have gone before us as we relate to and look at grief. The first one I want to talk about is that the grief process is the same for all. That's a misconception. Grief is as unique to each one of you as your fingerprints are. It's unique to every single individual. Let me tell you, I have several siblings. My siblings lost the same daddy, but they didn't lose April's daddy. You get it? We didn't grieve the same. We still don't grieve the same. We lost the same mama, but they didn't lose what April lost in mama, because I had my very own specific and unique relationship with each of my parents. And even though we shared the same parent, we didn't share the same experiences. We didn't share the same deep feelings. We didn't share the same inclinations. We didn't share the same secrets with our parents, right? So no two people grieve exactly the same, because the process is as unique as the individual is. Another misconception is that grief is a sign of weakness or weak faith. Anybody ever heard that or thought that? Or yeah. Sometimes we make people think that they are weak in their faith because they are grieving. Now, I'll let you know that I have read the Bible several times, and I've never seen in the Bible where it says, thou shalt not grieve. Actually, we know that the scripture says that we are not to grieve as those who have no hope, right? And this is for the church. We're not to grieve as those who have no hope. The scripture doesn't say you are not to grieve. But keep your eyes on hope. Keep hope in focus. And so grief is not necessarily a sign of weakness or weak faith. Grief is a natural process. It is a process of life, like other processes of life. And we know that grief can be a journey, but as long as we have hope in our view, then we'll get through that journey. We'll complete that journey. So another misconception is grief is only associated with death. No, it's not. People grieve loss and change that come that is not associated with death. I had an opportunity to speak to a large group of young women and a couple of men actually who are they're enrolled at a cosmetology school. Their student leader reached out to us and said, our students are grieving. Now, mind you, because we're in this pandemic, because we're just in this world, there were many who had experienced deaths of loved ones, but there were so many who had broken up with their boyfriends. There were so many who were children of divorce. They were grieving what they knew, what they used to know or used to have and no longer had. There was one particular young lady, very young lady, who had 3 children. But guess what? Because she had a problem with substances in her past, her children were taken away from her. Do you think her grief was any different than the mother whose child died in an auto accident? Still grieved very deeply, to the point where she couldn't even tell her story without sobbing and crying, because guess what? She can't hold her babies either. She can't just cuddle and feed and watch those babies sleep. The baby she gave birth to, she has no interaction with them. She can't even see a picture of them. So grief comes in many stages and in many ways, and grief can be associated with any type of loss. We can even experience anticipatory grief. Now, that is a grief that I kind of experienced with my grandmother before she passed away. And that is when grandma's not dead, but grandma's declining. Maybe grandma has cancer. Maybe grandma has dementia, Alzheimer's. And I'm already grieving. That means that I'm anticipating losing her forever. And so that is a big one, especially with caregivers of people who have chronic illnesses, terminal illnesses, that you begin to grieve. You begin to grieve what you knew about them. You begin to grieve that they can't live the life that they used to live. And so you have that grief that you're anticipating the road getting harder. And another misconception is grief is dark or of the devil. And we already know, we've talked about several scriptures about grief, so it is not of the devil. And grief does not have to be dark. True, there will be some dark days when we are in our grief process, but that does not mean that grief itself is dark. That means that we are in that process, and in that process, our emotions are so overwhelming that it seems dark, it seems gloomy. And grief should be ignored or suppressed? Absolutely not. The more we ignore it, the more difficult the grief process is. What we need to do is learn to go with the flow of grief. I like to say that instead of closing the door on grief and trying to lock grief out of your life, open that door and say, grief, come on in. Because my Father has talked to me about you, so I know how to relate to you. So we're going to do this thing. If you're going to be a part of my life, I'm not going to go kicking and screaming, right? I'm going to learn all that I can learn about the grief process, but at the same time, I'm going to drive the car. Grief, you can sit on the passenger side, right? And that's what it means to hold on to hope, even in your darkest days. Don't shut grief out. If you shut grief out, then you might shut out a little bit of grief, but when you finally open that door, that grief is going to be a monster. And it might come out and it might just jump out into your life at the most inopportune time. And so we want to make sure that we are inviting to this natural process, because as the sooner we invite it in and allow ourselves to really go through that process, the process will not be as long. And you'll go from that huge garbage bag to that pouch quicker. It may not go away altogether, but it'll be easier to carry. Another misconception is grief is only normal if it's brief. No, that is not true. That is not true. People who, we had one patient who did not come for grief counseling until 50 years after his baby died at birth. He never grieved the loss of his newborn baby. Why did he never grieve the loss? Because he was being strong for his wife. He was being strong for his wife. It was only when his wife came to the end of her life and died that the grief from her passing triggered the grief of the baby passing. 50 years later, and he was sitting in front of a counselor saying, I'm grieving the loss of my baby. And so, his grief was normal. People grieve differently. There is no timetable. There's no set time for grieving. And the last one is the absence of visible grief indicates coldness and unfeeling. That is such a misconception. But I think that if we are honest, a lot of us have been guilty of thinking that because people aren't crying at the funeral, because people maybe don't show up at the funeral, that they're cold, that they're unfeeling. But that's not necessarily the case. That's just how they are processing their grief. And there are some people who don't cry. They just do not cry. And so we're not to look at them and say that they didn't care. We're not to look at them and say that they're unfeeling people. They're hard, they're cold. That's just how they process grief. And remember, we all process grief differently. Next slide, please. So grief affects the whole person, physically, emotionally, psychologically, socially, and spiritually. That's a lot of ways, right? In all our ways, we can be affected by grief. And this slide really is to represent the fact that when grief enters our lives, it's like there are no boundaries within our lives. You know how when someone comes over to your house and you didn't invite this person, but they just stopped by and you see them pulling up in the driveway, and some of us go through the house and start closing doors because what if they have to go to the bathroom? We don't want them to go. We don't want them to look in the bedroom, right? So we do that. So grief is like this. Grief comes in, but grief doesn't have any boundaries. Grief will go in your bathroom. Come on, think about it. Grief will go in your kitchen. Grief will go in your bed and rumble through your drawers. Y'all say drawers? Drawers? Grief might do that. Don't put it past grief to do that. So grief will go all over your house. So know that grief affects us in so many ways, and the physical ways that grief affect us. There's a handout that you'll get later that talks about how there are some people when they're in their grief process, they lose a lot of weight because they have no appetite. Then there are some people who in the grief process, they'll gain a lot of weight because they can't stop eating. Eating makes them feel good. There are some people in their process, they're always looking tired because they cannot sleep. And then there are others who want to sleep all the time and pull the covers over their heads. So you see, it depends on who the person is in that process. And so when we look at all the ways that grief can affect us, thank you. Grief and loss can bring on many different emotions. And if you look here at all these emotions, know that this is not a comprehensive list. There are still some things that could have been put up there that is not. But grief and loss can make us feel intensely sad, angry, empty, lonely, shocked, anxious, fearful, overwhelmed, numb. That's, again, can't cry when somebody is just so shocked about the death and they feel numb. They just feel like, we talk to a lot of people who say they don't even remember their husband's funeral because they were not there. They were just psychologically and emotionally not there. Some people cry uncontrollably. And you know what? Leave these people alone. Let them cry. Let them cry. And I think that tears and laughter are two of the best and most beautiful, most just lovely things that the Lord gave us that we can use as medicine and healing is tears and laughter. So helpless and hopelessness is something that some people feel. There are people who feel guilt and regret, and this is a big one with siblings. I said that even if we're siblings, we don't grieve our parents' death the same. We have different processes. A lot of siblings, maybe the one that didn't come around as much, maybe the one who didn't send the money when the primary caregiver said we need money for mama's medicine or to get mama a special kind of bed or mama's briefs. Maybe they didn't do what they feel like they should have done for mama, and mama passes, and then they feel guilty. So they don't come to the funeral, or they don't come to the house when everybody's gathered. Guess what? They're in their process, and we have to do our best not to judge, not to condemn. Because guess what? The only one that could point to them and say that they're guilty for not doing what they were supposed to do is gone. We shouldn't take that place and that position. And I have here joy. Some people feel joy as part of their grief process. When someone passes away, some people feel joy. Some people feel joy because they know that experience that their loved one is in is so much better than the experience that they left behind, right? I always say when we're dealing with healing, especially with terminal illnesses, that God will either heal them here by taking the illness away from them, or he'll heal them by taking them away from the illness. And there are so many people who find joy in that, especially those people who have watched their loved ones suffer. Hope, gratitude, relief. Now, these are three that may not sound like they go along with grief, but actually they do. And we find that a lot of caregivers express that they feel gratitude or relief when that loved one that has struggled for so long finally passes away. Not that they're happy that they're passed away, but they're relieved that they no longer have to suffer. And get this is one that not a lot of caregivers want to admit, but they will admit it in closed session a lot of times, that they're relieved. Why? Because they can live a different kind of life, because they can breathe, because they don't have to spend every waking moment being the cook and the nurse and the chauffeur and the one who balances the finances and the one who makes sure that you get to all the appointments, and they're no longer on burnout, so they find relief, right? And that's not a bad thing, and these people should not be made to feel bad about that. Next slide. So, activity. This is an activity that I was going to do with pen and paper, but I will not. I'm going just to briefly talk about what do you make of grief. And this usually is an activity where I'll say, use one of those emotions that was on the other slide, and you can go back to that slide with the emotions. I usually say pick one of those, or either come up with your own. What are you feeling? What is the primary feeling that you have when you're in your grief process? What is the primary thing that maybe you struggle with when you're in your grief process? And the last time I did this with a group of widows at Lawndale Baptist. And someone said, pick sad, the word sad. So the point of the activity is, what do you make of sad? What do you make of grief? And she used, as an acronym, SAD, but she said, I'm still able to dance. Even though I'm sad, my husband is gone. 40 years plus married, and he's no longer there. I have to sleep alone. I have to eat alone. I have to make decisions alone. I am incredibly sad, but guess what? I can put on our favorite song or his favorite song, and I can dance in my living room, nobody watching, and I can feel good. So even though I'm incredibly sad, I can still dance. I'm still able to dance. So that is what the activity is. I encourage you all to do that at home, or do that. Those of you who are logged in, do that. And you can advance the slides again. And just to make sure that you can go to the next. Make sure that you take time to maybe try that activity. And I will tell you that it is therapeutic. It is really good. And also, when you take that word and make something else out of that word, you'll see how God just gives you these bright, just these bright words and bright phrases that come from that. And again, I think that is what Jesus was talking about when he says, now is your time for grief, but you can have joy intermingled with that grief. And I want you to know that you can get more information, and here is how. You can visit us on our website at www.authoricare.org, or you can call the Grief Support and Counseling Center at 336-621-5565. And there's my information, direct contact information on the side there. And I do want to take the remainder of the time, Pastor Chip, and just take questions or comments. Just allow you guys to share your experience, or share any comments or stories that you might have.
All right, come on, let's hear it from Miss April Herring. Lot of information. But you said something that struck me, where you said that instead of avoiding grief, say, come on and get on the passenger side. We're going to take this ride together, so that the grief is not controlling you. So how do you work at managing that so that grief doesn't take over your life? What do you do?
It is so very incremental. When we are on our grief journey, we will be, sometimes we'll feel like we need to take giant steps, like we need to rush through that journey, but the journey is going to be what it is. So we just take tiny incremental steps. And I like to say, I say a lot in my presentations, that when it comes to grief, do the best that you can every day. Just do the best you can every day. Your tomorrow might be a strong tomorrow. Your today might not be as strong, but that doesn't mean you're not strong. All right? It doesn't mean you're not strong. So what we do is, we don't even take it day by day. We don't take it hour by hour. We take it minute by minute when we are in our grief process. And it's a learned, I think, behavior. You know, resilience is a learned skill set. But we have been created, we were created to be resilient. And we can express resiliency in ways that really do not follow any kind of pattern. And I will say this, for those who are of the household of faith, that we have that extra, we have that divine, we have that dynamic, dunamis ability to be able to be resilient, because we do have the help of the helper on the inside of us. You know, I like to say that in grief, in change, in loss, there are people who will hire life coaches to kind of get them through that part of their life. But guess what? We have the most amazing and the most excellent life coach, personal life coach, living on the inside of us. Absolutely. Right? We do. So all we have to do is tap into that. Now, you say, how do you manage? It is not easy. It is not easy to feel in control when you're crying uncontrollably. It's not easy to feel powerful when you feel so weak and tired, and you feel as though you just cannot take another step or take another breath. It is not easy, but somewhere within yourself, you just have to know that it's going to get better. You have to know that I am still in control, even though I'm in my bed with my covers over my head, and I hadn't even taken a shower today because I'm just not feeling feeling it. I'm not with it. Pastor Chip is calling and I don't even want to take his call. Oh, just kidding about that. But no, that happens.
It happens.
That happens. So you have to know that where I am in this very moment is not where I'm going to stay. You just really have to. You really have to know that about your experience. That this is a process. It is an experience, and like any process and experience, I'm going to be on the other side of it one day.
Wow, that's good. So if we have questions in the audience, if you have questions, you can just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. If there are some questions online, I can take those and confer that to Ms. Herring at this time. I'm kind of looking through the post to make sure I don't miss anything to go on both sections.
I just want to say this. Can you share a little bit about grief not being linear?
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Grief is absolutely not linear. When we think about grief, and by that we mean it just doesn't go in this straight line, this straight, nice, neat, expected line or pattern. And you know what? That's one of the reasons why I do not include the 5 stages of grief in my presentations. Early on I did, because it's a wonderful foundational teaching. It's a wonderful concept. Dr. Kubler-Ross did some amazing work on that 5 stages of grief, but I no longer use it and take it out into the community because I never want anyone to feel as though I have to grieve like that. And if I don't grieve like that cycle says I should grieve, I'm grieving wrong. And that's one of the things that many people struggle with, because they feel like they're grieving wrong. Either people make them feel like they're grieving wrong, or they just within themselves feel like they are grieving wrong. So it's not linear. Actually, grief can come in waves. And it's kind of like this. You might be down here one day, then you're up here one day, and then you might spend 2 or 3 days or weeks down here, and then all of a sudden you go back up. That's just the natural, kind of unnatural pattern of grief. That's just that's the nature of grief. But you have to learn how to ride that wave. You have to learn how to ride that wave. And again, for those of us who are of the household of faith, we know who the captain is, don't we? We know who the captain of our ship is, the captain of our soul. So you have to tap into that thing that is so much greater than you, so much bigger than you, so much more capable than you. Tap into that and then learn how to ride those waves. You might have to leave your desk and go to the bathroom and just cry, get those tears out. You might have to do that, right? You might have to turn your phone off and just say, I can't have conversation with anybody right now. You might have to do that, but that's riding the wave.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So help us a little bit in this, because sometimes when we deal with grief, those of us who have not experienced the loss ourselves, we say stupid stuff. We make bad statements. And we're trying to relate. We're trying to, but sometimes we just say the wrong thing. What advice can you offer us that are trying to help other people navigate their grief process, as far as what we should say or should not say under those circumstances?
That's a wonderful question, Pastor Rice. And I will tell you that is what speaking the language of grief is all about. When I learned to speak grief, after I had been in this role for a while. And those of you who know that, those of you who have been through grief processes know that it's different. You're different in your grief process. Grief changes us. It truly does. It changes us. We're never the same after we go through that grief, right, baby? Yeah. After we go through that process, we're never the same. That doesn't have to be a negative. That can be a positive. That should be a positive, because then we can do as Isaiah says, that comfort those who are now in that process that you were in. You received comfort, so now use that comfort to comfort someone else. So we can use it like that. But being able to speak the language of grief will keep us from saying those, dumb things. But we have such a our intention is so good, and especially as believers, we want to encourage people, and we want to encourage them with what? The word, right? We want to do that. But how many of you know that when you're in your grief process, the word doesn't even sound the same sometimes?
Wow.
The word does not sound the same sometimes. And so I can say to my sister who may have lost her grandmother, and I can say, well, you know, she's in a better place to be absent from the body is to be present from the Lord. I'm not speaking grief. I am not speaking grief's language right then. Because that young lady is going to withdraw from me. And even though I know those words to be true, those aren't the words that she needs right now. So we have to be super sensitive to people's processes. We have to, and I like to say, I say that this is authentically April. This is not AuthoriCare. This is me. I love to say, in your grief process and in the grief process of others that we observe, give yourself grace to grieve, the grace and the space to grieve, the freedom to grieve, but also extend that grace to others when they're in their grief process. And I like to say that when we talk about speaking grief, there are 3 types of grief supporters that we do not want to be. We do not want to be a grief thief. Now, this is something else that's authentically April, but you don't want to be a grief thief. Now, think about it. What is a thief? A thief robs and steals, right? A grief thief is someone who shows up to help, but they end up stealing every opportunity that individual had to be healed through grief. Because the well-meaning person might say, well, stop crying. Your mama wouldn't want you to cry like that. Or your daddy or your husband wouldn't want you sitting around crying.
Wow.
How do you know what my dead husband would want?
Right.
You know, first
Right.
of all, but secondly of all, that's not what we need to be saying, because we need to encourage people to express their grief in whatever healthy way. I'm not even going to say positive way, because it might not be positive. They might cuss you out. But don't take it personal. And that's what we have to learn. Do not take the grief response personal, because they're in their process, guys. They are in their process. And so it may not even be positive, but as long as it's a healthy expression, encourage people to cry. Encourage them to laugh. Encourage them to get those emotions on the outside so it does not eat them up from the inside. So that's number 1. Do not be a grief thief. Number 2, do not be a grief hijacker. A grief hijacker is the person who comes to comfort you, but they talk about their grief more than they talk about yours. They come to see you when your daddy passed away, but then they talk about, Lord, when my daddy passed away, I thought I was never going to be right again. That's a grief hijacker. We should not do that to people. And sometimes we do it, we don't mean any harm whatsoever. But we have to be very mindful about what we are speaking to people when they're in their grief processes. And number 3, the last one, do not be a griefologist. That's somebody who knows everything about grief. They know everything. Even though they don't know you real well, they know everything about your grief. And so we can't, those are 3 ways not to show up to support someone who is in grief. And you know what? I always say, if you know the word of prayer, pray before you visit someone, before you call someone who's grieving. Just pray for the words to say. And I will say this, that people, it's not so much what you say, it's just being present. It's having a listening ear. Do you know one of the major attributes, that maybe the most major attribute that a good grief counselor has or needs to possess is what? To be a good, yes, sir, to be a good listener. So if we just listen to people, even if they tell their story over and over, stories help people get their grief out. Stories help them remember, but at the same time, stories strengthen our heart and give us hope. And so we need to become the just best listeners ever when we are supporting people who are in grief. And assess your team. I like to say to assess your team. And I think I had this for next week, but let's go ahead and just say it real quickly. You assess your team. Look around, scroll through your phone, and those who are not on team help me, put them on the bench while you're on in your grief in your grief process. Just bench them. You don't have to cut them. You don't have to cut them from the team, but just bench them for a little while and invite those on the court who give you hope, who strengthen you, who encourage you, not those who subtract from you and take away from you. Don't stop loving them. Don't stop liking them, but just give them limited access as you're in your grief process. It's okay to do that. I'm giving you permission.
Wow.
Tell them I said so.
That's when you look at your phone, you say, I just can't right now. I can't with you, not now. Wow. All right, so.
We have, honey, we have one question from Jerry Lowe.
Okay.
And Jerry said, you talked earlier about the social conditioning factor. Do you think we feel guilty sometimes about moving on too soon and fear backlash?
Oh my gosh, absolutely, Jerry. And I got excited for a minute because I have a cousin named Jerry Lowe. I thought it was him, but apparently not, because he would have said, hey. So absolutely, that's wonderful, Jerry. Thank you for bringing that up. And, socially, we can get in a place where we feel bound by the death of such and such. We feel bound to the role that we played in the lives of such and such. And for example, if there is a husband whose wife passes away, and that husband may feel bound by himself, by his family, by his in-laws, by his church, by his friends, to remain a single man for a certain period of time. And even a wife or woman who is now, and even a wife, if you're a wife and your husband passes away, people are going to expect you, right? People are going to expect you. Not that that's not an okay expectation to have of someone else, but they will expect you to remain single for an indefinite amount of time, and that keeps people in bondage. And it goes back to that feeling like a person is cold or they're unfeeling. If that man actually moves on a little earlier than we think he should, then we'll say, oh, he didn't love her. It hadn't been a year yet and he's already in a relationship. Mm-hmm. There are things that we need to leave at home when we're considering someone else's grief process, and our judgments are one. Our criticisms and our condemnation, we're to leave those at home. And we are supposed to just allow people to be in their grief process, in that journey, walk that journey the way that they walk that journey. Because believe me, we're going to need a little grace when we're in our own process. So that was a great, great question. And there are some people who feel like they have to keep the same friends after their significant other or their, best friend passes away. And, the best friend was a connection to you guys. So I no longer have a connection to you guys. Wow. So we have to have the liberty and freedom to move on in life. And just because you enter into another relationship does not mean you've forgotten that person. Never will that person be forgotten. But guess what? Life is for the living. Life is for the living, and we are to live our lives as long as God gives us life to live. That was great. Thank you, Jerry.
That was actually Cousin Jerry.
Was that Cousin Jerry?
What's up, Cousin Jerry? Wow. So this has been an amazing experience for us. I've learned a lot, and I hope this better equips me as I help others navigate the process, and then, of course, for those who are in the process to kind of rethink some things and understand the process. I know that there's some other things that we want to talk about, so we're going to come back on next Tuesday, and we're going to talk some more about grief, because I want the freedom that I know is there for people to experience, even though you're in a grief process. I think that it would probably behoove us to talk a little bit about regret on next week, whether it be with the person that you lost or any of the circumstances that surround that. What do we do with regret? Because I know that kind of eats away a lot of times at people on things that you did or did not do and didn't have a chance to do those kind of things. So hopefully we can touch on that when we come back again.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd love to, and we're going to talk next week about some coping strategies. Just how do we cope? Okay, here we are in this thing. Tell me how to cope, because all that stuff this week, all this stuff sounds good, but I need to have some practical things. I need to know really what to do and some things that I can do to cope well and healthy in that. So absolutely, we'll talk about that.
Good. All right. Y'all help me online and in the place. Help me thank April Herring again for being with us on this evening. Awesome presentation. Awesome
Thank
presentation. We have some handouts for those of you who are in here with her contact information and some more information and some other another little trinket. So you had to be here in order to get that. But if you were online, we left the information up. We'll try to get them to put that shot up again so you can have her information and the information for TheraCare. This has been awesome. I'm glad we have made the connection, and Maranatha is going to be better because we've come in contact with you and this great company. So we look forward to doing this again on next Tuesday at 7 p.m. All right. Father, thank you for all that you do for us, and thank you for helping us to understand grief and what it is. And I thank you that you're going to help us and strengthen us and encourage us to be better as we go through our processes. Bless your people now as only you can, for Christ's sake. Amen. All right, y'all, have a great evening. We love you, and hopefully I'll see some of y'all at church tomorrow. Praise the Lord for Bible study. Good night.